The world had shrunk to the size of her cabin years ago, and Alara had found she preferred it that way. At 45, she had buried a husband, the war, and any notion of a life lived in the company of others. Here on the slope of the mountain, there was only the wind, the pines, and the steady, predictable rhythm of her own solitude. She had her small garden, her knowledge of herbs, and the surgeon's kit her husband Daniel had left her. It was enough. It had to be. Love, she had decided, was a wound that healed poorly, leaving a scar that ached with the weather. She had no interest in being opened up again. The first flakes of a heavy snow were beginning to drift from a sky the color of slate when the sound came. A thud against her door. Too heavy for a branch. Too final for an animal. She froze, her hand hovering over the kettle on the stove. No one came this far up the mountain. Not since the last prospector had given up 2 winters past. She took the rifle from its pegs by the door, its weight familiar and cold in her hands. She did not bother with a question. A man with good intentions would have called out. She eased the door open a crack, the rifle held low. Sprawled on her stoop was a man, a dark stain spreading across the rough wool of his coat and melting the fresh snow beneath him. He was face down, a heap of limbs and exhaustion. For a long moment she considered closing the door. The world outside her cabin was not her concern. That was the pact she had made with herself. But Daniel's voice, a faint echo from a field hospital a lifetime ago, whispered in her ear. You don't let a man die if you can help it. It was the one piece of him she had never been able to bury. With a sigh that seemed to pull the cold deeper into her lungs, she leaned the rifle against the frame and knelt. She rolled him over. His face was pale, bearded, etched with pain even in unconsciousness. He was not old, perhaps 35, but hardship had carved its initials into the corners of his eyes and mouth. The wound was in his side, a ragged tear just below the ribs. It was bleeding sluggishly, the cold having done half her work for her. He would die out here in the snow. He would die on her doorstep. And his ghost, she suspected, would be more trouble than the man himself. Cursing her husband, the war, and whatever fool errand had brought this stranger to her, she hooked her hands under his arms and dragged him inside. He was heavier than a sack of feed, a dead weight of muscle and bone. The effort left her breathless, her heart hammering against her ribs. She got the door shut against the rising wind, the bolt sliding home with a definitive thud. The world was once again the size of her cabin, but now it held a bleeding man. She looked from his still form on her floorboards to her own hands, calloused and capable. The quiet was over. She spent the next few minutes in a flurry of practiced movement, the kind of efficiency learned in places where hesitation meant death. She stoked the fire until it roared, its heat pushing back the chill that clung to the man's clothes. She filled the large kettle and set it on the stove to boil, the hiss and steam a familiar prelude to her work. There was no time to wonder who he was or how he'd found her. He was a body, broken and bleeding, and she was the one who knew how to mend. Her small cot was too soft, too low. She needed him on the table. With a grunt, she managed to haul his upper body onto the sturdy pine surface, his legs dangling off the end. His head lolled to the side, and a low groan escaped his lips. He was stirring, which was both a good and a bad sign. It meant he was not yet gone, but it also meant he would soon feel what she had to do. She took the shears from Daniel's leather roll of instruments. The tools were kept meticulously clean, oiled against rust, each in its proper place. Touching them was like shaking her husband's hand. She began to cut away the heavy, blood-soaked coat, then the flannel shirt beneath. The fabric was stiff with half-frozen blood, and the shears made a thick, wet sound as they sliced through the layers. The wound was exposed to the lamplight, and she drew in a sharp breath. It was a gunshot, close range by the powder burns that tattooed the pale skin. The entry point was a messy pucker, the exit a larger, angrier tear on his back. The bullet had gone clean through. Another small mercy. No digging for lead, but it had likely splintered a rib and torn through muscle, perhaps nicked a lung. The bleeding was internal as much as external. He would die of that before infection if she wasn't careful. She could see the faint, rhythmic pulse in his neck, a fragile little bird beating against its cage. He was watching her. His eyes were open, a startlingly clear gray against the waxy pallor of his skin. They were filled with pain, but also with a sharp, unnerving lucidity. He tracked her every movement as she laid out her tools: needle, catgut, probes, and a bottle of whiskey. He did not speak, did not ask what she was doing. He simply watched, his gaze as steady as her own. She felt the weight of his stare, an intimacy more profound than any conversation. He was seeing her not as a woman, not as a recluse, but as the instrument of his survival. She met his eyes for a fraction of a second. "This will hurt," she said. Her voice was rusty from disuse, a tool left out in the rain. A faint, grim flicker of a smile touched his lips, then vanished. He gave a short, almost imperceptible nod. It was all the permission she needed. She poured a generous measure of whiskey onto a clean rag. The sharp, alcoholic scent filled the small space, overriding the coppery smell of blood. "Bite on this," she said, offering him a strip of leather. He shook his head, his eyes never leaving hers. A refusal, a challenge. She held his gaze for a moment longer, then shrugged. It was his pain. She pressed the whiskey-soaked rag to the entry wound. He hissed, his whole body going rigid on the table, his knuckles white where he gripped the edge. But he made no other sound. He held himself impossibly still, his breath rasping in his throat. She saw the sweat bead on his forehead, saw the muscles in his jaw bunch into knots. He was a man accustomed to pain, a man who knew how to wall it off and endure. She had seen soldiers like that. The ones who lived were always the quiet ones. She began to clean the wound, her touch firm and methodical, her mind narrowing to the task. There was only the damaged flesh, the thread, the needle, and the gray eyes of the stranger who refused to look away. Her hands moved with an economy born of grim practice. She worked by the steady yellow light of the oil lamp, the blizzard outside a distant, howling thing that had ceased to matter. The world had contracted to the surface of this man's skin, to the geography of his wound. She irrigated the path of the bullet with boiled water that had cooled just enough not to scald, flushing out debris and cloth. He flinched with each sluice of water, a sharp intake of breath the only sound he allowed himself. His control was immense, almost inhuman. She found herself admiring it, this stubborn refusal to yield to the agony she was inflicting. He watched her thread the needle, his eyes following the thin, dark strand of catgut as she pulled it taut. Her own hands were steady, the calluses on her fingertips giving her a sure grip on the small, curved piece of steel. They were not a young woman's hands. They were chapped from lye soap and splintered from chopping wood, the nails cut short and practical. They knew how to gut a fish, knead bread, and stitch a man back together. He saw the fine lines around her eyes, the way the lamplight caught the silver threads in her tightly bound hair. She was older than he'd first thought, not a girl, but a woman who had weathered her own share of storms. There was no softness in her face, only a kind of stark competence. She did not offer comforting words. She did not flinch from the blood that stained her apron or the raw reality of his torn body. She simply worked, her expression one of deep, unwavering concentration. In that moment, he trusted her more than he had trusted anyone in years. He had stumbled through the snow, guided by the improbable speck of her light, thinking only of survival. Now, under her hands, he felt a strange sense of calm settle over the pain. He was going to live, or he was going to die, and this quiet, severe woman would be the one to decide. "What's your name?" His voice was a dry croak, startling in the charged silence of the cabin. It cost him something to speak, a deep pull on the muscles in his abdomen. She didn't look up from her work, her needle already piercing the edge of his skin. "Elara." The word was clipped, offered without invitation for more. She set the first stitch, pulling the edges of the wound together. His skin was cold to the touch. He watched the needle dip and rise, a fascination with the mechanics of his own repair. "I'm Caleb," he offered to the top of her bent head. She gave a small, non-committal grunt, as if the name of the man she was sewing up was of little consequence. She was focused on the neatness of the stitch, the precise tension of the gut. Daniel had taught her that. "A sloppy stitch invites poison," he'd said, his voice gentle but firm as he guided her smaller hands. "Be deliberate, be clean." "What happened?" she asked, her eyes still on her work. The question was practical, not born of curiosity. She needed to know if there was other damage she couldn't see. "Disagreement," he said, the word catching in his throat. "Over a horse." It was a thin lie, and they both knew it. Men shot each other over cards, women, and land. A horse was rarely worth a gut shot unless it was a matter of deep and bitter principle. Elara did not press. The truth or falsehood of his story would not change the way she set a stitch. It was his business, just as her solitude was hers. She worked her way down the length of the wound, her movements rhythmic and sure. Dip, pull, knot, dip, pull, knot. The only sounds were the faint pop of the needle passing through skin, his ragged breathing, and the relentless scream of the wind outside. She was closing the exit wound now, the larger of the two. It required more care, the edges more ragged. "You're lucky," she stated, not as a compliment, but as a medical fact. "An inch to the left, you'd have bled out before you hit my door." He tried to laugh, but it came out as a choked cough that sent a bolt of white-hot fire through his side. "Lucky," he rasped, "isn't the word I'd use." For the first time, a flicker of something else crossed her face. Not quite a smile, but a softening of the grim line of her mouth. It was a dry, frontier humor, the kind shared by people who understood how narrow the margin between living and dying could be. She finished the last stitch and snipped the thread with her shears. The wound was closed, a neat, dark seam against his pale skin. The procedure was over. The raw, open wound was now a closed and bandaged fact. Elara washed her hands in a basin of hot water, the soap biting at the raw skin around her nails. The blood swirled and dissolved, turning the water a pale pink. When she was done, she looked at Caleb. He was still on the table, his eyes closed now, his face a mask of exhaustion and spent pain. The adrenaline that had kept him conscious and still was receding, leaving him vulnerable. He looked younger with his eyes closed, The harsh lines of his face softened. She felt a pang of something she couldn't name, not pity precisely, but a sense of profound responsibility. She had pulled him back from the edge, and now he was hers to keep alive. "You need to get into the bed," she said, her voice softer than before. He opened his eyes. They were clouded with fatigue. He tried to push himself up, but a sharp groan escaped him and he fell back, his arm trembling. "I told you not to move," she said, her tone sharp with a surgeon's impatience. "The stitches are fresh. You tear them, you'll bleed internally, and there's nothing I can do for that." She put a hand on his shoulder, not for comfort, but to steady him. His skin was hot. Fever was setting in, as she knew it would. She helped him sit up, taking most of his weight, and swung his legs off the table. He was limp, leaning heavily against her. She could feel the heat of his body through her thin dress, smell the lingering scent of whiskey and sweat and blood. It was a smell she associated with death, but he was alive, breathing raggedly against her shoulder. Together, they made the slow, shuffling journey to her narrow bed in the corner of the cabin. It was a miserable few feet, each step a carefully negotiated agony for him. He collapsed onto the mattress, his face pale and slick with sweat. She pulled the quilts up to his chin. 2 days, she repeated, her voice firm. You do not get out of this bed. You do not move unless you have to. You drink water when I bring it. Do you understand? He nodded, his eyes already drifting shut. He was surrendering to the inevitable tide of fever and exhaustion. The fight was over for now. He was in her care. The cabin fell quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet. It was no longer the empty silence of solitude, but the watchful silence of a sick room. The blizzard raged outside, sealing them in together. Ilara spent the rest of the night moving between the fire and the bed. She kept the flames fed, the warmth a crucial ally against the fever. She brewed a thin broth from dried herbs and jerky, the savory smell filling the small space. Every hour, she would return to his side, lay a cool, damp cloth on his forehead, and listen to his breathing. It was shallow and quick, the telltale sign of a body at war with itself. He tossed in the bed, muttering things she couldn't understand. Names, places, fragments of arguments. He was lost in the fever dream, his defenses down. In those unguarded moments, she saw not just a wounded man, but a man haunted by something. She saw the deep lines of a sorrow that had nothing to do with his physical wound. She sat in the rocking chair, Daniel's old medical texts in her lap, though she did not read. She simply watched him, a sentinel at the edge of his fevered sleep, while the storm outside did its best to tear their small sanctuary from the mountainside. She was a healer. It was what she did. But as she watched the stranger shiver under her quilts, she felt the unwelcome return of a feeling she thought long dead. A quiet, aching loneliness. The blizzard held them captive for 2 days and 3 nights. The world outside was a churning chaos of white, the wind a physical presence against the log walls of the cabin. Inside, time stretched and slowed, measured by the rhythm of Caleb's fever. It rose and fell like a tide. During the worst of it, he was delirious, his body slick with sweat, his words a tangled stream of memory and nightmare. Ilara worked tirelessly, forcing sips of willow bark tea between his cracked lips to fight the fever, changing the damp cloths on his forehead, listening to the sound of his lungs for any sign of fluid. She slept in snatches in the rocking chair, the rifle across her lap, a habit she couldn't break. In his delirium, He called out a name, Thomas, not with affection, but with a kind of pained fury. He spoke of ledgers and boundary lines, of a father's will and a brother's betrayal. She pieced together a fractured story, one she did not ask for but received in fevered installments. On the morning of the third day, the fever broke. He woke to find her sitting by the bed, her face cast in the gray light of dawn filtering through the single snow-caked window. She looked tired, the skin under her eyes bruised with fatigue. He felt weak, his body hollowed out and aching, but his mind was clear for the first time since he'd collapsed on her stoop. The fire in his side had subsided to a dull, manageable throb. "You look like hell," he said, his voice a dry rasp. She raised an eyebrow, her expression unreadable. "You should see yourself." She offered him a dipper of water, and he drank greedily, the cool liquid a balm to his parched throat. He lay back against the pillows, studying her in the quiet light. "You stayed up," he said. It wasn't a question. "Fevers need watching," she replied, her tone matter-of-fact. She rose and went to the stove, her movements stiff. She stirred something in a pot, the scent of oatmeal and dried apple filling the cabin. The simple domesticity of the act felt strange and profound after the life-and-death intensity of the past 2 days. "My husband was a doctor," she said, her back to him. The words seemed to drop into the silence of their own accord. "Army surgeon. He taught me." She had not spoken of Daniel to another soul in 5 years. She wasn't sure why she was doing it now. Perhaps it was the isolation, or the intimacy of having held this man's life in her hands. He saw the worst of it at Shiloh, Antietam. He came home whole in body, but the war followed him. It took him with camp fever 2 years later. Said it was a paltry way to go after all he'd seen. She brought him a small bowl of the thinned oatmeal. He ate slowly, each spoonful an effort. The food was a promise of strength, of a future. He watched her as he ate. She had offered a piece of her past, a rare and unexpected gift. He felt he owed her the same. "It wasn't a horse," he said quietly. She stopped her tidying and looked at him. "It was my brother, Thomas. He's the one who shot me." She showed no surprise, just a quiet attentiveness. He continued, the story pouring out of him now that the dam of fever had broken. "Our father died last spring. Left the ranch to both of us. Blackwood Range, biggest in the territory. But Thomas, he wants it all. He thinks I'm soft, that I don't have the stomach for what it takes to hold that much land. He's been buying up homesteads, pushing people out. I wanted to sell my half, give the smaller ranchers a chance to buy in. He saw it as a betrayal." He paused, the memory of the argument raw and fresh. "We were at the north pasture, arguing over the fence line for the Miller place. He said I was destroying our father's legacy. I told him our father was a thief who built his legacy on stolen ground. He pulled his gun." Caleb's gaze dropped to the quilt. "I never thought he'd do it. My own brother." Ilara absorbed his story without comment, her expression betraying nothing. She took the empty bowl from him. She had heard tales of the Blackwoods down in the town, a powerful family, ruthless in their expansion. They were a distant threat, a name synonymous with greed. And now, one of them was lying in her bed. The man she had saved was part of the very world she had fled, a world of violent men fighting over dirt. Her carefully constructed solitude felt suddenly fragile, the silence of her mountain on the verge of being broken by the clamor of his life. He must have seen the shift in her, the slight stiffening of her posture. "I was riding away," he said, his voice low and urgent. I was leaving it all behind. I wasn't writing for help. I was just writing. Your light was the first I'd seen in a day. He was not just explaining his wound. He was explaining himself. He was telling her he was not like his brother, not like his father. He was trying to sever himself from the name he had given her, a name that now hung in the air between them, heavy and dangerous. Blackwood. The name was a key, and it had just unlocked a door Ilara had not known was there. She looked at the man in her bed, the man whose life she had painstakingly stitched back together, and saw him for the first time not as a patient, but as a complication she could not afford. The world she had worked so hard to keep at bay had not just knocked on her door. She had invited it in and saved its life. Caleb watched her face, searching for a sign of judgment, of fear, of the revulsion his family name usually inspired in those they hadn't bought. He saw none of it. What he saw was a quiet, unsettling stillness, as if she were calculating a complex equation. She knew the name. He could see it in the sudden focus of her gaze, the way her hands, which had been so steady and sure on his body, were now clenched into fists at her sides. Blackwood, she said, the name a flat stone dropping into a deep well. Your father's men came by last year, offered to buy this land. He felt a cold dread seep into the warmth of the bed. Of all the cabins in all the mountains, he had ended up in this one. They offered you a price, he said, already knowing the answer. It wasn't a fair one. It wasn't an offer, she corrected him, her voice devoid of emotion. It was a warning. The revelation landed between them, recasting every moment that had passed. Her tireless care, her methodical skill. It had not been rendered to a nameless stranger, but to the son of the man who sought to drive her from her home. He was not just a patient. He was the enemy, delivered wounded to her doorstep. He saw the irony, bitter and cruel. The woman who had saved his life was one of the very people his family was crushing under the weight of their ambition. I didn't know, he said, the words sounding hollow and inadequate. My brother handles the acquisitions. He trailed off. What could he say? I am not like them? They were empty words from a man who had benefited from his family's ruthlessness his entire life. She turned away from him and walked to the window, rubbing a clear circle on the frosted pane. She stared out at the blanket of white, her back a rigid line of defiance. They said the winters are too hard up here for a woman alone, she said, her voice distant. Said I would be better off in town. Safer. She had sent them away with a rifle in her hands and a look in her eye that promised more trouble than the small parcel of land was worth. They had not been back. Until now. In a way, they had finally returned. He was here, a Blackwood, bleeding in her bed, dependent on her for his very survival. The power dynamic had been brutally, exquisitely inverted. She was no longer just a healer. She was the woman who held the life of a Blackwood in her hands. She could let his wound fester. She could send him out into the snow. She could exact 100 small vengeances for the threat his family represented. She turned back to face him, and her eyes were like chips of winter ice. You were right, she said. Lucky is not the word I would use. The professional distance she had maintained was gone, replaced by something far more personal and dangerous. He was no longer an abstract medical problem to be solved. He was Caleb Blackwood, and his presence in her cabin was a threat to the one thing she had left, her peace. He had brought his family's war to her, and the blizzard that had seemed a prison now felt like a temporary shield. But the snow would melt. The world would return. And when it did, she would have to decide what to do with the man she had saved. The knowledge of who he was changed everything. The intimacy of the sick room curdled into a tense, watchful suspicion. He was the son of her enemy, and she was the woman who knew exactly how fragile the thread of his life truly was. The thaw came on the fourth day. Sunlight, sharp and brilliant, streamed through the window, reflecting off the pristine snow with a blinding intensity. The world outside was silent, muffled, and clean. The storm had passed, and with it, the fragile truce that had existed within the cabin. The silence between them was no longer one of shared ordeal, but of wary distance. Ilara tended to his wound with the same methodical care, but her touch was impersonal, her questions clipped and clinical. Any pain? Does this feel warm? He answered in monosyllables, acutely aware that he was an unwelcome burden, a symbol of a world she despised. He tried to thank her, to explain again that he was not his brother, but the words felt like apologies, and she did not seem interested in them. She was simply waiting for him to be well enough to leave. Late in the afternoon, she was outside, clearing a path to the woodpile, when she heard it, the rhythmic crunch of hooves in deep snow. It was a sound she had not heard in months, and it sent a spike of alarm through her. She shaded her eyes, looking down the trail. 3 riders were making their way up the mountain, dark figures against the vast expanse of white. They moved with purpose, their horses struggling in the deep drifts. Even from this distance, she knew. It was trouble. It was his trouble. She went back inside, her face grim. "You have company," she said, bolting the door behind her. Caleb struggled to sit up, his face paling. "3 of them?" he asked. She nodded. "Thomas," he breathed, a look of grim certainty on his face. "He must have found my horse." He swung his legs out of the bed, hissing in pain as the movement pulled at his stitches. "My gun," he said, his eyes scanning the cabin. "Where is it?" "Don't be a fool," Ilara snapped. "You can barely stand. You think you can win a fight against 3 men?" "I can't let him find me here," he said, his voice ragged with desperation. "He'll kill you for helping me." The thought that he had brought this danger to her door was a greater pain than the wound in his side. He saw the rifle by the door, the one she'd had when she first found him. He started towards it, staggering. Ilara moved to block his path, placing herself between him and the weapon. "Get back in bed," she ordered. Her voice was low and commanding, the voice of a surgeon in a chaotic field tent. Outside, a voice called out, sharp and impatient. "Hello, the cabin! We're looking for a man. Rode this way 2 days ago. Tall, dark hair, injured." It was Thomas. Caleb sank back onto the edge of the bed, his head in his hands. They were trapped. Ilara looked from Caleb's despairing face to the solid oak of her door. The world she had barred for so long was now demanding entry. She could give him up. She could tell them he was here. Let them take him. It would be the sensible thing to do. It would remove the Blackwood problem from her life forever. She would be safe again in her solitude. But then she pictured his wound, the neat line of stitches she had so carefully placed. She thought of his impossible stillness under her hands, his quiet endurance. She had fought for his life for 3 days. She found she was not willing to give it up to the man who had tried to take it. She walked to the door, her face set like stone. She did not take the rifle. "Who's asking?" she called through the wood. "Thomas Blackwood," the voice replied, laced with arrogance. My brother has had an accident. We're here to take him home." Ilara drew the bolt and opened the door just enough to look out, her body blocking the view of the interior. 3 men sat on horseback, their faces chapped by the cold. The one in the lead had the same dark hair as Caleb, but his eyes were colder, his mouth a hard, thin line. "There's no one here," she said, her voice flat. "I've been snowed in for 3 days. Haven't seen a soul." Thomas Blackwood's eyes narrowed, sweeping over her, dismissing her as a plain, middle-aged woman of no consequence. "My brother's horse is tethered in your lean-to," he said, gesturing with his chin. "Are you calling me a liar?" The choice was made in that instant. It was not a grand, romantic decision, but a simple, stubborn refusal to be bullied, a refusal to let this man's violence win. "I'm saying I found a horse wandering lame," she said, her voice as cold as the wind. "As for your brother, if he was shot, he's likely dead in a snowdrift somewhere between here and your ranch. A man with a gut wound wouldn't have made it this far." She used her medical knowledge as a weapon, her certainty giving the lie its weight. Thomas hesitated, his gaze shifting from her implacable face to the unforgiving wilderness around them. What she said made sense. Caleb should be dead. "I'd like to take a look inside," he said, his hand moving toward the pistol on his hip. Ilara didn't flinch. She simply stood her ground, a small, unmovable obstacle in his path. "This is my home," she said quietly. "You are not welcome here." From inside the cabin, Caleb heard the exchange. He heard the quiet steel in her voice as she lied for him, as she faced down his brother. He heard the threat in Thomas's tone. He could not let her face this alone. He had brought this to her. He had to end it. Pushing himself to his feet, ignoring the searing pain in his side, he stumbled to the doorway, appearing behind her. "Thomas," he said, his voice weak but clear. His brother's face registered shock, then a flash of pure rage. He had not expected to find him alive. "The land is yours," Caleb said, leaning against the doorframe for support. Ilara put a steadying hand on his arm. "All of it. I'm done. I relinquish my claim." It was the only thing he had left to bargain with. His name, his inheritance, his past. He was laying it all down, right here on this woman's doorstep. Thomas stared at him, his mind working. This was what he wanted. His brother gone, the ranch his. The fight was over. He had won. After a long, tense moment, a slow, triumphant smile spread across his face. "That's the smartest thing you've ever said, little brother." He wheeled his horse around. "Let's ride," he barked at his men. They turned and rode away, leaving tracks in the clean snow, their presence a fading stain on the silence. The immediate threat was gone, but the echo of it remained, vibrating in the cold air. Caleb slumped against the doorframe, the sudden release of tension draining the last of his strength. Ilara guided him back to the bed, her touch gentle now, the clinical distance replaced by a shared vulnerability. He collapsed onto the mattress, his breathing shallow, his face ashen. He had pushed himself too far, and the wound, which had begun to heal, was now a fresh source of agony. She examined the bandage. A small, dark spot of blood was beginning to seep through the white linen. "You fool," she whispered, her voice a mixture of anger and relief. "You absolute fool." "He would have hurt you," Caleb rasped, his eyes closed. "It was my fight." "It became my fight when you bled on my floor," she countered, her hands already moving to fetch fresh bandages and warm water. She worked in silence, cleaning and redressing the wound. He had torn a single stitch near the edge. It was not serious, but it was a setback. As she worked, her knuckles brushed against his skin. It was no longer the impersonal contact of a healer and a patient. It was something else, something forged in the shared danger they had just faced. He had given up his entire world for her. She had stood between him and his brother's gun. A transaction had occurred, unspoken but deeply understood. They had chosen each other. When she was finished, she pulled the quilt over him. He was shivering, the shock and strain bringing on a new chill. He looked small in the bed, stripped of his name, his family, his past. He had nothing left but the life she had saved. She stoked the fire, adding logs until it blazed, but the cabin still felt cold. The confrontation had let the winter in. She looked at him, shivering under the layers of wool and cotton, and knew the fire wasn't enough. She hesitated for only a moment. Her own needs had been an afterthought for days. She was bone-tired, chilled to her core. Practicality, she told herself, was what drove her next action. Nothing more. She took off her boots and lay down on top of the quilts beside him, her back to his. She did not touch him, but the space between them was filled with the heat of her body. It was a gesture of profound, almost shocking intimacy, more potent than any kiss. She was offering her warmth, her presence, a shield against the cold and the dark. He felt the subtle shift in the mattress as she lay down, felt the warmth of her body seep through the layers of blankets. The shivering began to subside. He did not turn. He did not speak. He simply lay there, breathing in the faint scent of wood smoke and herbs that clung to her, and felt a sense of peace settle over him for the first time in years. He was no longer Caleb Blackwood, heir to a fortune built on intimidation. He was just Caleb, a man with a hole in his side, lying next to a woman who had faced down his demons with nothing but her own stubborn courage. In the quiet of the cabin, with the setting sun casting long blue shadows across the snow outside, they lay side by side. Two solitary people who had, by some strange and violent alchemy, found themselves no longer alone. He reached a hand back, not to touch her, but just to have it near her, and his fingers brushed against the rough wool of her dress. She did not pull away. The contact was a small, quiet anchor in the vast silence. Weeks turned into a month, and the deep snow of the blizzard slowly receded, revealing the pale, sleeping earth beneath. Caleb healed. The wound in his side became a puckered silver scar, a permanent reminder of the moment his life had fractured and reformed. Ilara checked it less and less, her touch evolving from a healer's assessment to something softer, more personal. He never left. Ever, he moved from her bed to a pallet by the fire, and then, as his strength returned, he set about making himself useful. He chopped a mountain of wood, enough to last 2 winters. He repaired the leaky roof of the lean-to and mended the fence around her small garden plot. He moved with a quiet purpose, his large frame a constant, reassuring presence in the small cabin. They spoke little, but their silence was now comfortable, filled with the easy rhythm of 2 people sharing a life. He learned the specific weight of the water buckets she preferred, and she learned that he liked his coffee black and strong. These small, unspoken intimacies were the bricks with which they were building something new. One evening, as she was grinding herbs with a mortar and pestle, he came to stand behind her. He did not speak, but she could feel his presence, the warmth of him at her back. He reached out and gently took the pestle from her hand. His fingers brushed hers, warm and calloused. He continued the grinding motion, his rhythm steady and strong. She leaned back against him slightly, a small, almost unconscious gesture of trust. "The land," she said quietly, her voice barely a whisper. "What will you do?" He stopped grinding, the silence of the cabin broken only by the crackle of the fire. "This is my land now," he said, his voice low and certain. "If you'll have me on it." She turned in the circle of his arms, her hands coming to rest on his chest. She could feel the steady beat of his heart beneath her palm. She looked up into his face, into the gray eyes that had watched her so intently as she'd saved his life. The pain was gone from them, replaced by a quiet, steady light. "There's work to be done before planting season," she said, her practical tone belying the tremor in her own heart. It was not a declaration of love, but it was an acceptance. It was a yes. Spring arrived in a rush of meltwater and birdsong. The mountain came alive. And with it, so did something in Ilara. The solitude she had once cherished now felt like a memory of a leaner time. The cabin was still her sanctuary, but it was no longer a fortress against the world. It was a home. Caleb worked the land with a devotion she had never seen in another man, turning the soil, clearing stones. His hands, once soft, now becoming as calloused as her own. He was planting roots, literally and figuratively, in the soil his family had once tried to steal. They built a new room onto the cabin, a small bedroom, so he no longer had to sleep by the fire. They worked side by side, raising the walls, their movements a practiced dance. One afternoon, a wagon appeared on the trail below, a rare sight. It was the Millers, the family whose homestead Thomas had been trying to claim. Mr. Miller was helping his wife from the wagon. She was in labor, and the baby was coming too fast to make it to town. He had heard whispers of a healer on the mountain, a woman with a surgeon's hands. He had come in desperation. Ilara did not hesitate. She brought Mrs. Miller inside, her focus narrowing instantly to the task at hand. Caleb was there before she even had to ask, his presence a quiet support at her back. He kept the water boiling, held Mrs. Miller's hand when the pains became too much, and spoke to her in a low, calming voice. He was not a doctor, but he was a man who understood pain and fear. Ilara worked through the long afternoon and into the evening, her skill and calm presence filling the small cabin. As dawn broke, the cry of a healthy baby girl echoed off the log walls. Later, after the exhausted but grateful family had left, Ilara stood on the stoop, watching the sun rise over the distant peaks. Caleb came and stood beside her, handing her a cup of coffee. She leaned her head against his shoulder, a gesture that was now as natural as breathing. "You were good with them," she said. "You have a gift." He looked down at her, a small smile playing on his lips. "I learned from the best." He had seen her then, not just as the woman he had come to love, but as the healer she was born to be. He saw the strength and purpose that animated her, the fierce compassion that she tried so hard to hide. He had arrived at her door a broken man, seeking only to survive. He had found not just his life, but a life he had never known he wanted. Ilara looked out at the vast, wild beauty of her mountain. She had come here to be alone, to heal from the wounds the world had given her. She had believed love was a scar. But now, standing beside this man, his warmth a solid presence against her, she understood. Love was not the wound. Love was the healing. It was the steady hand in the dark, the quiet presence by the fire, the shared work of building a life. It was the unexpected gift that arrived, bleeding on a snowy night, and chose to stay.